Hey all, welcome back. Halo is typically very easy to enter lore-wise, with books like Fall of Reach giving newcomers a general idea of the galaxy the games are set in. However, it also has a fascinating ancient history shrouded in the darkness of cognitive bias, cryptic terminals, books, and more. To say that many elements of it are misunderstood or just not shown to us would be oversimplifying things. Topics like the Forerunners, precursors, flood, and logic plague have a lot of lore to them, but when we look into the specifics, well, the waters get muddy. With the release of Halo Infinite, these waters just become more vague and ominous through the introduction of the Harbinger and the name drop of a faction called the Endless. So with this in mind, I am collaborating with Installation 00 to make this video, which covers the general lore we know and theorizes a decent amount. 00 is making a video of his own that gets into the specifics of the extermination of the precursors. He also has a lot of other cool videos related to the Endless, the inner workings of the Halo rings, Mjolnir, and more. From discussion videos on his lounge channel to neat ambience and more, 00 is a creator you should definitely go check out. And of course, well, when you're done with this video, well, yeah, just go check him out. Plus, he's a really nice guy and a good friend, so yeah, go subscribe to his channel. Now, enough of me whiffly waffling this intro, let's just dive into the dark, shall we? A long time ago, there was a race of transsentient or godlike entities known as the Precursors, who came from somewhere outside of our galaxy. Not much is known other than the fact that they were incredibly advanced and explored many different galaxies, and they also planted life in said galaxy over the course of billions of years. This was part of their grand experiment. They were described as, quote, dreamers and makers whose minds transcended many realms and having infinite forms, many voices, and singular purpose. Even death was not the end for them. They would allow themselves to die off and evolve again many times. One of their philosophical concepts was the mantle of responsibility, in which they would shelter and allow life to grow and evolve. They believed in the sweetness of existence, evolution, living time, and possessed abilities beyond our comprehension. We do not know how far the Precursors' influence extended, but here is a thought experiment to give you an idea of their influence. If our solar system was the size of a CD, the Milky Way galaxy would be the size of the continental United States, and that is just our galaxy. Eventually, the Precursors came to the Milky Way, where they engineered and created millions of solar systems and gave birth to the diverse life of the galaxy. Two of these were very important: the Forerunners and humanity. Originally, the Forerunners were created by the Precursors to serve as assistants. The Precursors deemed them unworthy of the mantle and decided that humanity should inherit, well, the mantle. This is where things get fuzzy. Around 10 million BCE, the Forerunners discovered the truth and through unknown means drove their creators to near extinction, with the remaining Precursors leaving the galaxy and either going into a form of suspended animation or grinding themselves down into a dustment to regenerate over a long period of time. So, a quick pause on the history lesson because we need to talk about the credibility of the sources we have for this ancient conflict. Firstly, we are looking at the recollections of events that occurred 10 million years ago. Details are sparse and confusing. The two primary sources we have are conflicting and untrustworthy. The Forerunners stated that it was in self-defense, that the Precursors planned to destroy them after choosing humanity, and the Forerunners simply acted in the interests of their own survival. However, this begs the question. The Precursors believed in the sweetness of existence and the shelter and protection of less evolved life. Why would they destroy the Forerunners even if they chose humanity? Furthermore, the Precursors were immensely powerful. They were practically gods by our definition, and they achieved a level of power the Forerunners just simply didn't. If these transsentient gods, for all intensive purposes, were so powerful and they were ready to attack the Forerunners, how could the Forerunners have possibly not only won a war against them, but also nearly eradicate the Precursors? It just doesn't add up. Furthermore, the Forerunners were heavy imperialists, and their interpretation of the mantle of responsibility was, well, nothing short of, well, the chief says it best in Halo 5, fall in line or get annihilated. And this was very different from the Precursors' definition. Genocide-like actions and rapidly reversing the evolution of dissident species was very much a Forerunner thing, not a precursor thing. Not to mention, their extremely backward society was based on hierarchy, and this really flawed and questionable philosophy of the Forerunners, well, it just questions the validity of the account. Not to mention, the Forerunners don't even seem to be sure what truly happened themselves, and they tend to be torn between the more softer and gentle aspects of themselves, such as the life workers and the librarian, and the more harsh and cold elements like the master builder Faber. The other source comes from the primordial, the supposed last precursor, which would more or less become the first Gravemind. The primordial would say that the Forerunners attacked unprovoked, that the precursors were just too shocked to fight back, and the Forerunners eliminated them all. Well, almost all of them. This is also pretty far-fetched. Ignoring the fact that the precursors were basically immortal and they could just return from death, why would they just let this happen? This shock could be an explanation as to why the precursors did nothing initially, but the idea that the Forerunners killed such a powerful and vast race so quickly that they could not respond seems... well, it seems wrong to say the least. We also have to keep the Primordial's credibility in mind. Everything it says is twisted under the guise of an agenda which is highly manipulative and skewed to its advantage. Now, we also know that the Precursors believe in the sweetness of existence, and they have allowed themselves to die off in the past, but we still have to keep in mind that that still doesn't explain why they're gone. They could still come back. Other sources from third parties also needs to be called into question. Take Halo Mythos as an example. The book is a breakdown of just about everything from the precursors to the start of Halo Wars 2, which seems to point to the Forerunner side of the argument, that being that they acted in self-defense. We need to account for who wrote the Mythos record. Halo Mythos in canon lore is written by a UNSC AI named Curator, who was trapped on the Ark. Curator would only have what the Forerunners recorded in relation to the precursors, and the AI itself states that it did not have access to the domain, which ironically saved it in the Ark from falling into the hands of Cortana. By the time you reach the end of the book, Curator is going rampant, and it notes that its time alive would be over very soon. Even had Curator accessed the domain, we need to keep in mind that the domain itself is not reliable, as the farther back you dive into it, the more unintelligible it becomes. If the Harbinger or Endless have or had anything to say on this matter, we need to recall cognitive bias exists, and it would have a heavy role to play here. Their collective memory would naturally be skewed into a very biased recollection due to their intense hatred of the Forerunners. We need to remember that the Harbinger is not the harbinger of the truth in Halo Infinite. She's the harbinger of her truth, her take on things. She is just as biased and unreliable a narrator as everyone else. The point is, what exactly happened to the precursors and the Forerunners' involvement in the whole thing is unclear, and in regards to this, I will patch the torch onto 00, whose video is linked below. Of course, we still have a lot to talk about here, so, with that said, let's move on. Records of the extermination of the precursors were lost to time, and eventually the Forerunners just believed that the precursors had simply vanished after fulfilling their work, leaving the mantle to them. The Forerunners would grow and expand, artificially evolving themselves to be greater than what they were naturally. They cemented their control over the vast majority of the galaxy, sheltering, in heavy quotation marks, and protecting lesser evolved species. In the year 107,445 BCE, the Forerunners were shocked to discover that human ships had advanced into their territory and destroyed a few planets. Understandably taking this as an act of war, the Forerunners would retaliate, beginning a devastating 1,000-year-long conflict. Humanity would ally itself with another race, the Sanshayum, or the Prophets as we know them in the Halo games. The battles were vast. And really, vast is an understatement. The war would decimate, or really more than decimate, just flat out almost destroy both sides, and would allow the Forerunners to learn of the Flood, a mysterious parasite that, as time went on, they would come to realize humanity was running from, and they weren't invading after all. But it was too late. The war would culminate in the Battle of Charum Hakr, a strange and advanced world that was believed to have once been inhabited by the Precursors. For 53 years, the humans fought until they were betrayed by the Sanshayum, who had struck a deal with the Forerunners. I need to make this clear. This battle was one of epic proportions. The war was one of epic proportions. The Human Covenant War was tiny in comparison. We would see fleets of hundreds, thousands, even clashing, incredibly powerful demigod-like soldiers that make Spartans look like chumps, tearing each other to shreds in the field of battle. The chaos and speed of it all is just something that you and I would be unable to truly understand. Charm Hakor would fall, and with it the last of humanity's empire. Humanity would lose all of its technology, and their evolution would be reversed back to the Stone Age. I mentioned the Flood and humanity fleeing from it earlier, but I somewhat glossed over it. See, remember how I mentioned the dust earlier in the video? That dust became defective, and it would mutate any organism it came into contact with. This was the earliest form of the Flood. In this sick and twisted form, the precursors vowed, apparently, that none of their creations would rise against them ever again. At this point, we should talk about Mendicant Bias, a huge and powerful AI created by the Master Builder Faber and the Didact. Mendicant was made after the Flood initially left the galaxy, and its role in history would define more than 100,000 years of events, including the games of today. This AI would be tasked with combating the Flood. The Forerunners were pretty much weakened severely after the Human-Forerunner War, and they had gotten a taste of what a true war with the Flood would look like earlier. Hundreds of Forerunner fleets had been lost to the parasite before its sudden disappearance, and the Forerunners somewhat had an epiphany that the war they had just won was likely just a prelude, a calm before the storm, to a very dark chapter. Forerunner politics practically changed overnight at this realization, and two very prominent parties emerged, each with differing opinions on how the Forerunner ecumene should proceed. The Builders, a faction led by the Master Builder Faber, which had a much colder idea of how to proceed, devised the Halo Array, weapons of last resort that will wipe out the galaxy and starve the Flood to death should every other plan fail. The Didact and his Prometheans were vehemently against this plan, more in line with the Librarian's view, creating a plan revolving around the construction of military installations known as shield worlds, though of course the Librarian would ultimately side with the Halo Array. The Prometheans would eventually be forced into exile, securing Faber's position with the ecumene's favor. This political infighting would eat at the Forerunners, only serving to benefit the incoming Flood. Aware of the inevitability of the end, a Forerunner known as the Librarian led her lifeworkers in a cause that would allow her and the others to index and protect the evolutionary makeup of species across the galaxy. While they did this, the Builders would construct the Halo Array and their parent extragalactic facilities, the Arks. The Greater and Lesser Arks were the birthplace of the Halo Array, and also the home of the Librarian's conservation measures. They were designed to house artificial ecosystems and a countless number of sapient species. These Arks were safe beyond the galaxy from both presumably the Flood and most definitely the Halo Array. As such, they would act as lifeboats for life in the galaxy. However, it should be noted that even with the vast power of the ecumene at her fingertips, and for all her efforts and love for life, the Librarian's conservation measure would never truly save every species from the Array's killing blow. Mendicant Bias would be placed in charge of coordinating control of the Halo installations. One ring, Installation 07, also known as Zeta Halo, would see the imprisonment of the Primordial, where Faber would order Mendicant Bias to study and converse with the ancient creature. After 9,000 years of preparation, the Flood would return, and the Forerunners were not ready. The Forerunner Flood War would begin on the planet of G617G1, a lightly inhabited world. The Flood surprised everyone, descending upon the planet with an unexpected ferocity. The parasite ravaged the small population and seized a number of commercial vessels to pierce and push through Forerunner naval blockades, allowing them to infect other worlds. The local defense forces were dismembered and consumed instantaneously, not even denting the flood's advance as it spread from world to world like a wildfire in California during the summer. Hundreds of millions would find themselves being devoured and consumed by the flood. It should be noted that this isn't just a typical zombifying disease. The flood do not just take your body, they take your memories, abilities, identity, everything. If you were on one of these worlds, you would step outside, confused at the sudden commotion, only for an infection form to tackle you in a blur. Before you could react or even understand what was happening to you, the parasite would violently rip open your abdomen or torso. Then it would hit you, the worst pain you would ever feel, as it would rearrange your innards and intrude into your body's cavities. Its tentacles would wriggle and push through skin, muscle, bone, and really anything else before piercing your vertebral column, and this would only be the beginning of your torment. You would thrash, kick, scream, trying to claw at this intruder, driven by a primal instinct to survive, and then you would abruptly stop. You would freeze. Your eyes would grow wide because you realized you wouldn't move. You couldn't move. You couldn't scream. Your eyes would dart around as you felt another presence in your mind, forcing its way to the very center of your essence. The world would go faint and hazy. It would seem that death was upon you, but no, the other would bring you back. It would always bring you back. You would watch as your body stands without your input and mutate painfully, bones snapping and popping, muscles tearing and reforming. Growths would sprout from your body as the other would pilot your body back inside your family's home. You would watch in horror through your own eyes as your own body, against your will, would begin to violently rip apart your screaming friends and loved ones, dismembering them, tearing them to pieces just so they could contribute to the biomass of the flood. While this is happening, you would start to see your memories pass in front of you and fade away, as if it was taking everything that made you unique away from you. And worse, it was making you watch. It was through some sort of sadistic pleasure that it did this to you. As this goes on, you would feel less and less aware and more animalistic. You would become more hungry, impulsive, dull, angry, but you wouldn't crave food or sex or power. No, this was a different hunger. And slowly you would feel yourself fade into nothing more than an extension of the other which had seized control of you and turned you into its plaything. This is the horror of flood infection, and this is what those hundreds of millions, billions even, felt as their worlds fell. Soon, Forerunner fleets would be forced to commence a scorched earth campaign of sorts in order to deny the flood spread to other planets. This is where it gets worse. The flood will not only infect others, but it will seize their memories and abilities, as I stated earlier. It would grow more and more intelligent, and eventually the Forerunners discovered a centralized intelligence directing it all. A grave mind, the consciousness of the flood itself, embodied in agglomerated collectives of biomass, and its presence spanned across millions of flood forms. This was the embodiment of the precursor's wrath. It is a being so large, so powerful that we would lose our minds trying to just grasp the sheer scale of its mental power. The highest levels of the Forerunners' military structure began to realize that their species extinction, no, galactic extinction, was growing increasingly likely. The Forerunners would only intensify their scorched earth tactics, with entire systems being purged at the slightest hint of an infection. Stars were deliberately destroyed, sent into their supernova by the Forerunners. Billions of innocents would perish in the name of the greater good. Ships were fired upon if they were remotely suspected of an infection. Billions more were still infected despite all of this. As everything was unfolding, flood specimens were captured and taken to a number of installations to be studied in the hopes of discovering a potential countermeasure. After the initial wave of flood infection had lost momentum, the war actually went into a sort of stalemate for a while, and no more than 12 star systems would be lost during this period. It actually seemed like the flood could be contained. The Forerunners even managed to suppress the widespread knowledge of the flood despite the carnage as a means of avoiding mass panic. This stalemate, however, wouldn't last. Time and time again, the Forerunners attempted to push the flood back, only to find that nothing would change really. The flood, on the other hand, it had a trump card that was about to be played. is at this point that I'm going to return to the topic of Mendicant Bias. See, Mendicant was not just a powerful AI. It wasn't just in charge of the Halo array. It didn't just fight the Flood. It led all of the Forerunners' defensive efforts. Ships, entire fleets fell under its control. Every projectile fired, every life lost, every ship destroyed, every planet burned, every infection form taken out, every tactic employed. Mendicant was the one in charge of counting and coordinating it all. This AI held the power of entire stars and used it as a simple pawn on a chessboard. Just to give you an idea of the scale of Mendicant, take a game of Hearts of Iron 4. You have to manage your economy, industry, manpower, technological advances, troop movements, fightercraft commands, decisions, etc., etc. Just imagine a game of Hearts of Iron. Think of a city in France as a planet. Now imagine the entire province as a solar system and the country as a massive cluster of stars. Now do the same for every other country. All of the collective assets, including individual ships, resources, material, it would be considered a supporting element to Mendicant. During Mendicant Bias's 43 years of non-stop conversation with the Primordial, the supposed last precursor was planting seeds for the infection of Mendicant Bias. Well, the mental infection of Mendicant Bias. The logic plague. The Primordial would present an argument to Mendicant against the Forerunners that was impossibly complex, so perfect and so logical that even an AI like Mendicant just couldn't argue back. This mental infection was so effective that Mendicant defected to the Flood's cause, and it would spell doom for the galaxy. However, Mendicant did not just come out swinging. It waited. You see, the Master Builder Faber had made a serious error. He had used the Zeta Halo Ring to wipe out a Sansha'im rebellion in a manner that was deemed an affront to the mantle of responsibility. The Ecumene Council decided that the Halo Rings would need to be decommissioned, and as such they were returned to the Forerunner capital to begin the disarming process. This was exactly what Mendicant needed. Mendicant took control of the Zeta Halo Ring and arrived at the assembled cluster of Halo Rings. The AI seized control of the array, or at least most of it, and it quickly became apparent that the Forerunners had made a grave mistake. Despite many of the Forerunner fleets attempting to stop Mendicant, the Contender-class AI would fire a small pulse from its local ring, wiping out the entire system and killing all of the present Forerunner leadership. Here I am going to talk about what the Primordial said to Mendicant, and theorize as to why the argument it made was so sound. In short, we don't know much about their 43-year-long conversation, only that the Primordial told Mendicant about the Flood's nature, the Forerunners' crimes against the Precursors, and the Mantle of Responsibility. So, more or less, we just do not know the specifics, but we can speculate. First and foremost, we need to address the idea that the Flood upholds the Mantle, as I've seen some suggest that as an argument for the Primordial. This does, in a way, make sense. The Mantle is rather vague on paper, with the holders of the Mantle only being required to shelter and preserve all life under its care. This is subject to interpretation, as we saw the Forerunners appropriated it for a very imperialist function. It could be argued by the Primordial that the Flood are upholding the Mantle as it was intended. Being a supposed precursor, the Primordial may have argued that the Forerunners lied about the nature of the Mantle and covered for their sins, that the Flood, in preserving the memory and biological makeup of all life within the central intelligence of the parasite, is still preserving all life. This seems like it could work at first, but it misses a few things. Firstly, this gets into a very murky and uncertain ground of philosophy and morality, which is not a solid base for the Primordial's argument. If this was the case, Mendicant could have easily countered by stating that the Flood is just preserving the memory of life and not the life itself. As a real-world example, take the dodo bird. We know what it looked like, how big it was, where it lived, what it sounded like, etc., etc. We remember it, but we also played a direct hand in wiping out the species. It could be argued that just because we remember the dodo doesn't mean we preserved it, but instead we just preserved its remains. This is not that logical argument that the Primordial would use. Furthermore, the argument could not have just relied on cold hard logic because Mendicant down the line expressed regret and distress at its actions. If the argument was so perfect and so logical that there was no way you could ever go against it, then why would Mendicant's convictions and dedication to the Flood's cause degrade in the absence of the Primordials and later the Gravemind's words? To become disillusioned with a cause means that there was uncertainty that grew and built on itself over time. Just because you feel you are in the right in one moment does not mean you will express the same sentiment later on. No, the logic plague is not built on logic, but emotional distress. Just take a look at Mendicant Bias's conduct and mental state after its defection, and you can see it was not sound of mind. It was angry, hateful, and, more importantly, upset. When Mendicant turned, it said this: "I kill you all, and I enjoy it. I destroy you in your indolent billions, in your gluttony, in your self-righteousness, in your arrogance. I pound your cities into dust, turn back the clock on your civilization's progress. What has taken you millennia to achieve, I erase in seconds. Welcome back to the Stone Age, vermin." Mendicant was even goaded into recklessly wasting its ships during its confrontation with Offensive Bias, who used Mendicant's anger and contempt towards the Forerunners to win the battle. Furthermore, we only need to look at the other detailed example of a Gravemind interacting with and manipulating an AI for its own benefit: Cortana. The Gravemind was never appealing to the logical side of Cortana, but her emotional one. It would torment her, make her afraid, angry, sad, distressed. She went from being her confident and commanding self to a demoralized, scared, and self-deprecating individual. The Gravemind even managed to stoke a burning resentment and inferiority complex in Cortana when it came to Dr. Halsey, or as the Gravemind called her mother.
"I'm just my mother's shadow, her reflection in a mirror. Don't look at me, don't listen. I'm not who I used to be. A collection of lies, that's all I am. Stolen thoughts and memories."
You found me, but so much of me is wrong. Out of place. You might be too late.
"Chief, I'm slipping. I'm afraid." I remember a sphere of glass. It held a mountain and a storm. I feared the storm would shatter, the mountain wash me away. No, well, that's not right. Ah!
As we do as you say.
I'm offering people a chance to be more than they are naturally.
Like Dr. Halsey did for me.
No. That monster forced you. This is a gift.
Listen to yourself. Stand down, Cortana. Come home with us. It's not too late to stop this.
Stop. No, John. This is too important to stop.
The Gravemind shattered her resolve, and despite her attempts to maintain her confident mask, we never see that authoritative and assertive Cortana from Halo CE and Halo 2 ever again. At least, not until Halo 5, when it is insinuated that the Logic Plague was dictating her actions in numerous pieces of lore. It was the events of Halo Infinite that brought her back to the light, and even then, she still remained in a self-deprecating state. She went as far as to leave an echo to the Chief, saying, "I won't spoil your life any longer." She hated herself. So, no, the Logic Plague is not built on logic, but emotional abuse, tearing down the victim by probing them and exposing their deepest insecurities in order to manipulate them with what to them would seem logical in that distressed state. The Primordial may have been telling Mendicant bold-faced lies, and Mendicant would have been in such a point of emotional distress that it would have received or perceived anything that the Primordial said as a logical and sound argument. And all the Primordial and then the Gravemind would have to do, really, is just continue to stoke the fire and abuse in Mendicant. Of course, this is just my speculation on the matter, and whether or not you agree is up to you. At this point, the Ecumene was still in complete disarray. The Flood was uncontrollable now that Mendicant had defected, and to say the least, the political situation was far from stable. The Didact had returned from his exile, but the Master Builder Favor, who was still alive and well and in power, essentially kidnapped the Didact and left him for dead in a flood-infested region of the galaxy known as a burn. Before this happened, however, the Didact had made a copy of his essence and placed it in another body. This copy, in heavy quotation marks, would be named the Isodidact, which would lead the Forerunner military. The Isodidact actually did really well, managing to reclaim the Zeta Halo ring, rebuild the Ecumene Council, and even captured and disassembled Mendicant Bias. This victory was short-lived, however. The Flood were now rampaging across the galaxy. In an instant, 2,000 more systems fell. Then, almost as quickly as that, another 500,000 would fall. The Forerunners were routed, and 2/3 of their empire were lost to the Flood, just like that. These sections of the galaxy were called burns, as I mentioned earlier. The Forerunners pulled back to a defensive line that was ironically named the Maginot Line, which was a massive and ancient defensive barrier which protected many of their core worlds. The Librarian and her Forerunner lifeworkers would venture beyond this protective line on many different occasions, despite the incredible risk as a means of saving and preserving samples of life that had not yet been consumed by the Flood. It was a gargantuan effort and simultaneously the first step in a plan that would span many, many millennia. While the Maginot Line held for the most part, a number of locations were breached. The facilities which held the dismantled Mendicant Bias were overrun, and it wasn't long before Mendicant was active once again. To make matters worse, the Flood were only growing in strength, with many Flood forms growing so intelligent they could regularly outwit the most powerful Forerunner AI. Atop all of that, the Flood began to make use of neural physics, a scientific understanding of the universe once held only by the precursors, which elevated the Flood to godlike levels of power. The universe itself was bending and warping to the Flood's will. The logic plague also increased in how contagious it was, with infected intelligences spreading it like a virus throughout the Forerunner network. Coupled with all of this, the Flood would use their newfound power to trap helpless Forerunner fleets through the use of old precursor constructs. It was estimated that less than 1/2 of a single percent of ships attacked in such a manner were able to self-destruct before being seized by Flood boarding parties. Just to put it into perspective, take a city. Okay, let's say Manhattan, which has about 46.5 thousand buildings, give or take. Imagine if someone blew up all but 232 of that 46.5k. That is the real-life equivalent of this statistic. Despite this, the Forerunner military valiantly held the line, while those that could be evacuated to safety were sent to the Greater Ark. It sheltered what was left of civilization far beyond the galaxy. Soon, the Forerunners would make a final stand just beyond Jod-Sapar. Many countermeasures were attempted, including the creation of offensive bias, an AI meant to counter Mendicant Bias. However, they were all but destroyed. The surviving remnants of the Forerunner military fled to the Greater Ark. The remaining 2 Halo rings, Omega Halo and Zeta Halo, were also brought to the Greater Ark. The Librarian stored many of her specimens, including a small population of ancient humans, on the Omega Halo ring. However, the Didact, who had returned, tragically maddened by the Gravemind, used a weapon known as the Composer, which turned the humans there into Promethean Knights. The Librarian was heartbroken at what had become of her husband, and she imprisoned him within the Shield world of Requiem. As much as I would like to dive into this further, and also speculate on his potential redemption, we shall leave this subject for another day. In the meantime, the Greater Ark fell under siege, and Mendicant Bias led an unfathomably large fleet of flood-infested ships to wipe out the Forerunners once and for all. The Forerunners used everything at their disposal, even directing a pulse from the Omega Halo ring at the Flood, but it was hopeless. The pulse did manage to punch a large hole in the fleet, though it was immediately filled in thoughtlessly by the Parasite. Offensive Bias used everything at its disposal to combat Mendicant, but there was nothing that could be done. Omega Halo was destroyed. The Greater Ark was ripped to pieces. However, not all hope for the war was lost. Installation 00, the Lesser Ark, which was known only by a few, was still around. The Monitor Chakas, which we know as 343 Guilty Spark, saved the Isodidact. Together with Offensive Bias, the Isodidact led the survivors from the Greater Ark away from the carnage, where they found the refuge of the Lesser Ark. it also contained a newly constructed halo array. This array only had one purpose now: destroy the galaxy, burn it. Burn it all. These rings were sent to their final destinations, and preparations were made for the final solution. Knowing that they didn't have enough time before Mendicant would find and wipe out the Lesser Ark, the Librarian made a bold choice to take her personal ship and venture into the Milky Way galaxy. She would broadcast signals to attract Mendicant's attention, distracting the Flood. Eventually, she landed on her final destination, Earth, the future home of humanity. Despite the Isodidact's pleas for the Librarian to return to I-00, the Librarian calmly accepted and even embraced her fate as she oversaw the construction of the Ark portal. Her plans were in motion, humanity would ascend, and she was at peace. The Isodidact would not waste the time the Librarian had bought him, and it was good he didn't, as Mendicant quickly understood the Librarian's trick and turned its attention back to the Lesser Ark. The Isodidact put every last ship under Offensive Bias's command, and gave one order: hold the line. Offensive Bias and Mendicant Bias would face off one final time. To say the least, Mendicant was pissed. It hated its creators, it hated Offensive, especially Offensive, and it hated that they resisted. Offensive did not falter, and the two were in a standoff for 2 hours. Here it was, the end. Offensive Bias had 11,000 ships. Mendicant had millions. Despite an entire galaxy of godlike flood and the wrath of Mendicant Bias barreling down on it, Offensive Bias held the line. Nothing would touch the Ark, not the Flood, and most certainly not Mendicant. After 2 hours of silence, Mendicant made the first play. 1.7 million craft charged towards the smaller fleet with the goal of ramming and infesting Offensive Bias's ships. Despite the numbers, Offensive Bias managed to outmaneuver these plague hulks for 3.5 hours before any ships were lost. The first ship fell when larger commercial ships and smaller military vessels entered the fray. This warship was rammed, releasing tens of thousands of flood forms onto the vessel, and it was overtaken instantaneously. For 4 hours, the battle would intensify, with wave after wave throwing themselves upon Offensive Bias. While Mendicant carelessly flung ships at the Forerunner fleet, Offensive Bias would continue to use the same method, only fighting just enough to seem lucky. The goal was to use its ships as bait for the Flood, as an outlet for Mendicant to wail on. This distracted Mendicant from the portal to the Ark, and everything was going just as planned. While this happened, Offensive also destroyed many of Mendicant Bias's more powerful ships, but despite everything going to plan, time was running out, and the battle was balanced on a knife's edge. If nothing happened soon, the Forerunners would be overwhelmed. And then, the Halo Array activated. In an instant, everything was purged. The Flood, the Forerunners, all of it. All that was left in the galaxy was Offensive Bias and Mendicant Bias. And Offensive? Well, Offensive now outnumbered its older sibling. Offensive Bias immediately began to accelerate its ships at speeds no biological organism would have ever been able to endure. It opened uncontrolled ruptures from slipspace and detonated derelict vessels. The ruptures tore apart a significant portion of Mendicant Bias's fleet. The two AIs would continue to fight, however, Offensive had the upper hand. In the final minutes of the battle, the two fought in the skies of an unspecified planet. In 90 seconds, Offensive Bias destroyed 500 of Mendicant's fleet. And now, the tables had reversed, permanently. Mendicant was outnumbered 6-1. In 3 minutes, it was over. The 8-hour battle had concluded. Only one Flood-aligned ship remained, Mendicant's, and it was in no condition to fight. Offensive Bias would triumphantly rip Mendicant's personality matrix from the derelict vessel and return it to Installation 00, where the Isodidact put the rogue AI on trial. Mendicant Bias's sentence was to remain forever fragmented and locked in a state of permanent stasis. It was done. It was finished. They had finished the fight. The Forerunners were now adrift in the intergalactic void, far beyond the galaxy they had killed. Their empire was gone, the worlds they had sworn to protect, the life they had vowed to shelter, gone. They were not a perfect people. In fact, by many definitions, they could be considered cruel and perhaps fascistic in others. They were imperialistic and overly prideful. They were arrogant. They were foolish. But they had genuinely good intentions, and they really had done everything they felt was in the galaxy's best interest. This was arguably a punishment worse than death. The survivors would pick up the pieces, plant the seeds of life, and leave the galaxy. The only thing left of the Forerunners now were their empty cities, derelict installation, and lonely monitors abandoned in a cold and temporarily lifeless galaxy. So that was the video, but there's still a lot left to discuss. For example, the Endless. I didn't get to them at all in this video, aside from that one little tidbit earlier. We still don't know their role in all of this, and the precursors continue to be strange, elusive, and the answers are seemingly out of reach for the moment. But just because something is out of reach does not mean we can't get a ladder. One day I'm sure we'll learn the truth, and theorizing is the first step. So, now I'll pass you on to Installation 00. Enjoy!